morning, all the attendees and sir to ISAP online classes. And we have with us eminent faculty Dr. M.N. Parshuraman, sir, Assistant Professor of English, UC College, Trivandrum. And he will be dealing with B.R. Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste, which is under the session of Dalit literature. So over to you, sir. So you can start.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good morning, all of you. Jai Bhim. I'm a little nervous. I'm excited. I'm a little nervous talking about B.R. Ambedkar's Annihilation of Caste. Because excited because for me, he's the greatest Indian who ever lived. I'm not going to go on and on about his greatness now because we need to get into the text. But he was the chief driving force behind our constitution, behind the Reserve Bank of India, behind all the laws which we have guaranteeing rights for working women, including maternity leave and equal wages and things like that. All of them may not have come into practice, but they are in the statute books at least, and he is the single biggest person responsible for it. All the rights which married, homemaking, or I would say only homemaking Hindu women enjoy, inheritance, equal inheritance, and all those things, property rights. He is behind the freedom. Of course, it's not a very easily accessible freedom, but at least again, it's there in the books. The freedom for people to marry outside their caste and creed in this country, in spite of popular opinion being overwhelmingly against such marriages. He is behind the rights for factory workers all over the country. Some of them are being rolled back now by certain state governments under the pretext of the COVID damage to the economy. But then they are important. The 8-hour working day instead of 12 hours, and a certain mandatory minimum number of holidays and benefits. All those things. He's behind all these things, and this is just a kind of a brief summary of his achievements. So, I mean, you can imagine what kind of a person we are dealing with. And I'm apprehensive and nervous, of course, because I'm going to be talking about annihilation of caste, and I don't know, it's a little problematic. I'm a person who has not experienced any discrimination of any kind in my life, practically none. And I'm talking about a text which is a kind of manifesto against discrimination and fighting against discrimination and bringing liberty, equality, and fraternity in the true and deepest sense into practice. So how far I am going to do justice is an open question. But anyway, I'll get to the text and stop with the personal stuff. The annihilation of caste was originally intended as a speech. Ambedkar was invited by certain Hindu social reformers, caste Hindu social reformers to be specific. Of course, they did not believe in caste, or at least they said they don't believe in caste, and they wanted to do away with caste and reform Hindu society and consolidate and unite Hindus. The organization was in the Punjab, Jat Pat Thodak Mandal, headquartered in Lahore. And Ambedkar was in Mumbai, then Bombay, and they wrote to him sometime in 1935, inviting him they saw him as a great Hindu reformer. You know, somebody whose ideas were very deep and very deeply studied and real, and who could possibly be the answer to revolutionize Hindu society, change it from within. And they invited him to address them at their annual conference as the president, as the invitee president. And the Mandal sent him a letter, And he sent them a reply. They wanted a text of his speech, and he sent them the text. And they wanted a clarification because in the text he said, he had made a statement that the only way to destroy the caste system is to destroy the religious notions on which it is founded. I will repeat that since it's a key statement. The only way to destroy the caste system is to destroy the religious notions on which it is founded. And that kind of unsettled them a little. And their secretary, Mr. Santram, he sent Ambedkar a letter asking him to explain what it was. And Ambedkar sent him an explanation. I won't get into the details of the explanation, but when Santramji received that explanation, they asked Ambedkar to leave out that statement from his proposed speech. And he refused. And then they kind of gave him a kind of ultimatum, like if you don't leave out the statement, we will be compelled to cancel our invitation to you to address our annual conference as president. And he said, there is no question of leaving out that statement. You can cancel your invite. And he had already printed several copies of his speech, because this speech was not just for Jat-Pat Thodak Mandal, but it was for a wider audience also. And he had printed multiple copies. And he decided to publish this as a speech. And he published it, and it was lapped up by Hindus across the country, sold like hotcakes. It went into 2-3 editions, and people responded to it. People, including Gandhi, responded to it. Many were critical, many were appreciative and endorsing of it. And it was translated into a lot of Indian languages very rapidly, including Malayalam. There is a Malayalam edition, not very easily seen, but it's there, Jadi Unmulanam. So that's the kind of history of this annihilation of caste. And Ambedkar says that it's a tragic kind of relationship, the relationship between caste Hindus and untouchables. They were called untouchables in those days. Ambedkar uses the term untouchable in most of his writing. In another book which he had written, called What Gandhi and the Congress Have Done to the Untouchables. A very instructive and informative book. I think every Indian should read it. He had rejected the term Harijan as being condescending. And he had not yet come upon the term Dalit. In fact, Dalit was not his original contribution. It came from others. But he had not yet come across the term and endorsed it. So he stuck to the official British terminology of untouchables for convenience sake. And he said it's a very tragic relationship because even those Hindus who want reform, they are afraid of alienating their more orthodox, their more non-reformist fellows. And as far as untouchables are concerned, we have no option but to have reform to be carried out, because reform is necessary for us even to live a minimum dignified existence as human beings. And there were criticisms, as I told you, of annihilation of caste. He did not respond to those criticisms except Gandhi. He said, I don't think Gandhi's criticisms are valid, but then Gandhi is regarded by many Hindus as an oracle, and so I have to meet his arguments, because otherwise a lot of Hindus won't get my message. So this is what he says regarding that edition and so on. Actually, all of Ambedkar's work is freely downloadable. From the Ministry of External Affairs website, you can download it free. There are 17 volumes, 20 big PDF files. It's worth downloading and reading them. I have read a few of his books. Of course, I'm a child. I have a long way to go with Ambedkar. And you get them in some other sites also of Dalit intellectuals and activist collectives like velivada.com and certain other sites as well. And you can read them for free on the website of the University of Columbia, the Columbia University, New York, one of the world's best universities then and now, the place where Ambedkar did his first PhD. So coming to the text itself, he talks about the opponents of social reform in India. He says that in India you have two groups of people opposed to social reform. He was writing this, he had written this in 1935, and so it's in that context, but things haven't changed entirely, maybe partially, but not entirely. Perhaps not at all. It depends on your perspective. He says the first group of opponents are political reformers, people who say that political reform should come first and everything else can wait. Okay. He doesn't mention and elaborate this very much in Annihilation of Caste, but in certain other books, like what Gandhi and the Congress have done to the untouchables, he talks about it in detail. People like Lokamanya Bal Gangadhar Tilak, who said that all reform must wait. First we need Swaraj. Swaraj is my birthright and I shall have it. Everything else can wait. And that was one class of reformer, and they got an upper hand in the Congress. Initially, when the Congress was formed, it was not a primarily political reform party. It was kind of both ways, social and political reform, and it was a very open umbrella kind of thing. And they were not very clear where they were going. There was a plethora of ideas, under the broad umbrella of the Indian National Congress. But the political only reformers, or the political first reformers, if you would like to call them that, they got an upper hand, and in fact, they asserted it pretty violently. There was an active social reform faction in the Congress. That faction organized a meeting, and the political first people, they even attacked the meeting and burnt the pandal of the social reformers. So, though Ambedkar doesn't give all those gory details in this book, the struggle was pretty bitter and intense. So you know what he was saying and the solid grounds on which he was saying it. And the second group which Ambedkar talks about were the socialists or the economic reformers. People who said that it's the class system which is the villain and economics is the villain, unequal distribution of wealth. You remedy that and everything else, to use a cliche phrase, I'm sorry, no offense intended, അത് നേരാക്കി കഴിഞ്ഞാൽ പിന്നെ എല്ലാം ശരിയാവും. Okay, that kind of thing. And they were the other group, and Ambedkar has his criticism of them also. And he comes to that. And then he goes on to talk about the condition of untouchables in India. He gives a recent in those days. Remember, we are in 1935. About the condition of an untouchable community in present-day Maharashtra under the rule of the Peshwas, and all the the humiliating things. They are not out even today, unfortunately, even so many years down the line. Like they had to carry a pot under their neck so that if spit fell, it wouldn't fall on the earth and pollute the earth, and broom around their waist to sweep away their footprints and so on. And then he talks about recent incidents also, dating back to 1928, where again there is untouchability and social boycott and less than human treatment of untouchables. Okay. And unfortunately, these incidents, though he's talking about 1928 and earlier, we come down the line to the 21st century and you think of the Khairlanji massacre in Maharashtra, where an entire family was killed for daring to own land and work on it. You realize that things haven't really changed too much, nowhere as near as they should. Anyway, so Ambedkar argued that social equality and fraternity must come, if not first, at least simultaneously with political equality, political reform, economic reform, social reform. These things should either go hand in hand or, social reform actually should come first. And he cites certain examples in this book from Europe. Okay. He talks about the Reformation in Europe by Martin Luther, and he said that came before political emancipation. He talks about the Puritan movement in England, which ended the absolute monarchy and made it a parliamentary monarchy and unwritten constitutional monarchy. And he said that also started on the plane of spirituality and social engineering before a political program. And he said the Puritan ideals not only brought reform into England, but they inspired the American War of Independence also. So those are the examples that he cites from world history for social reform preceding political reform. And then as far as economic reform is concerned, he says that proletarian unity, the Marxist, communist, socialist roadmap is that proletarian unity will bring the seizure of power and all structures by the working class. And then you will have a non-exploitative society coming into being. And he says that for proletarian unity to come into existence in the first place, you need a feeling of social fraternity, a feeling among all working class people that they are all one. And that will not happen in a society which is divided along caste lines. That's the argument he put forward. That was in 1935. And we can see it in later history. I personally believe that history has proved him right because land reforms, they did not work as quickly as they ought to have in all the states of India. They worked to a limited extent in Bengal, where the land was taken away from the older zamindars and it went into the hands of farmers who were already fairly prosperous and who had their own land. But it did not go further down. It did not go to the marginal landholders or the people who actually worked on the land and who didn't have anything as an asset except their work, their working power, labor power. And land reform, here I don't know, I could be mistaken, but people from Kerala who are more familiar than I am with Kerala history have told me that even in Kerala, the land reforms traveled down, up to even up to marginal landholders, a few marginal landholders to some extent, mostly down to tenants, a few marginal landholders, but they did not travel down to the people who were actually landless or who did not have any noticeable or in any way significant amount of land. Dalits in Kerala were landless laborers, almost all of them, and they continue to remain the poorest. And the land reform gave them a little bit of kind of Porambok kind of land, the land immediately surrounding their households, perhaps. But large sections of the Dalit communities in Kerala did not really benefit substantially from reform the way tenants had done and the way large and medium farmers had done. Uh, these are the reasons he gives for social reform being primary. He doesn't dismiss the other kinds of reform, but he says that this has to come first. Otherwise, it's a case of, he doesn't say it, but I'm saying it. It's a case of putting the cart before the horse. Um, then he goes on to talk about certain arguments which are advanced in favor of the caste system. Like there were a lot of people in Ambedkar's time, including large sections of the Arya Samaj and other Hindus, including Gandhi to a great extent, at least in his speech. His practice was different. And Gandhi, though I don't regard Gandhi as a Mahatma, I'm not uncritical of him. I don't say Gandhi ji, I just say Gandhi. But to Gandhi's credit, he allowed his thinking to evolve quite a lot over the years. And the Gandhi of the 1910s or 20s or 30s was not the Gandhi who was just before his death. A lot of water had flowed under the bridge. You have to give it to Gandhi for that. But coming back to this, even Gandhi had justified the Varna, saying that it's just a division of labor. Why this fuss about a division of labor? Division of labor is there in every society, every religion in the world. And to this, Ambedkar poses two questions. He says, okay, divide labor by all means, fine, that's scientific. But why divide laborers? Division of labor is understandable. But why four classes of people, Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra? That is not labor, but that is laborers. You're dividing laborers. And that is not necessary, it's absurd. And the second thing he says is that why is the division based on birth and not on merit? Okay. Even the earliest mention of Varnashrama Dharma, which appears in the Rig Veda, the 10th mandala, one of the later portions of the Rig Veda, in the Purusha Suktam. I used to recite Purusha Suktam in my childhood. I don't remember it now. I won't recite it now. But, the Purusha Suktam says that Brahmins come from the face of the Parabrahman, of the universal. And the Kshatriyas from the arms, the Vaishyas from the thighs, and the Shudras from the feet. And that is clearly based on birth. It is not based on labor or actual proven merit or skill in the actual exercise of labor and skills. So why birth? Division on birth is inherently unequal and unscientific. And then he goes on to certain people who say that the caste system was good because it helped to maintain racial purity. And he says this argument has got no basis in history, because before the caste system solidified and became a pan-Indian reality, India was a welter of racial mixture. There was tremendous racial admixture. And you can't really point to a single Indian and say that so-and-so, she has got Aryan or Dravidian or any other kind of features, because we are so mixed. And then he also said, even if you talk further about racial purity, then why are the restrictions not confined to 4 divisions? Why have they permeated down to castes? Castes are in hundreds. Not the varnas, but the jatis. Jatis are in hundreds. And even the subcastes, there's no subcaste intermarriage also. How do you justify that in the name of racial purity? And then he said, how is racial purity affected if people eat with each other, interdining? Okay. In our times, due to certain economic conditions, maybe interdining is more common. You bloody well have to interdine sometimes, otherwise you starve, which is good. But in Ambedkar's time, interdining was also a rare thing. And so he says, why the bar on interdining? And, and he said, again, if we say that racial purity has come through this, he gives a disturbing statistic and he says that it has been proved that Hindus are wanting in stamina and 90% of them are unfit for military service. So we have to start looking at what racial purity, quote unquote, has done to us, if at all it exists. And then he goes on to say that Hindu society is a myth. Okay, these charges sound very serious, and we may be disturbed or provoked by them. But what I would say is, you may feel angry. Allow the outrage, watch it within you, but then cool down and try to see where Ambedkar was coming from. And his reasoning is very solid. If you look at it that way, I at least have not found him wanting at all. So he says Hindu society is a myth. The word Hindu is of Persian origin, not found in any Sanskrit text. And later Ambedkarite scholars, people who trace their own intellectual legacy to Ambedkar, like Kancha Elia Shepherd, who wrote Why I Am Not a Hindu, who lives and works in Hyderabad from Telangana. He follows this very same argument. He said, when I was a child, we never had we never identified as Hindus. We were all Madigollu, Gollollu, Bapannollu, Kammollu. Okay, these are the various Telugu castes. Okay, and Ollu is the plural indicator. So I'm mentioning them. There was no Hindu Ollu. Okay. And then that is one argument. Then Ambedkar says that people argue for Hinduism as a category based on geography. Okay. This argument is particularly significant in Savarkar's book called Hindutva. That is another interesting book that you should read. Of course, Savarkar is a red rag to many a secularist bull. But, one should always take one's enemies at least seriously enough to read them and to give the devils their due. That much is, I feel, essential as a part of intellectual honesty. Anyway, so he says geography, Ambedkar says that geography does not constitute a society. Similarity of habits, customs, beliefs, and thoughts, which may come as a byproduct of a certain geography, they do not constitute a society either. And he says primitive tribes across the world, you study them, you look at them, they have tremendous similarities, though they are not bound by geography. So geography by itself, is not enough. This bird does not fly. And then there is a quotation. Okay, it's on the screen. He says, to have a similar thing is totally different from possessing things in common. And the only way by which men can come to possess things in common with one another is by being in communication with one another. This is merely another way of saying that society continues to exist by communication. Indeed, in communication. So if you want to call yourself a society, Hindu society or Muslim or Christian, whatever society you are, you need to ask the question, is there communication between members of that society? Okay. It need not be tremendous communication, but a certain minimum level of communication and sharing it's absolutely necessary. Okay. It's to use a pompous Latin phrase, it's a sine qua non. Okay. For calling yourself a society. And so he says that there needs to be, to unite any nation or any society, there needs to be shared activity in which everybody feels that he or she has got a real stake. And that is missing in Hindu society. Because all activities in Hindu society are shared along caste lines. And he also says that by preventing, Ambedkar in several of his writings, including this, he touches upon it in in his books on Hinduism, Riddles of Hinduism, and Philosophy of Hinduism. He talks about it, and several other in his epic Mahad Satyagraha speech. He says that the caste system is maintained by endogamy, that is, by a ban on marrying outside the group. And he says that what this does is to perpetuate enmity and rivalries across generations. And he talks about England. He says there were rivalries in England and other societies. But he said that the people who fought against each other during the Wars of the Roses, the descendants of those people were able to fight together in World War I and World War II, or the Civil War, which happened in 1642, between the Puritans and the Royalist Party. He said that the descendants did not carry the burden or the feud of enmity from their ancestors, and that is because there was no endogamy. There was no bar on marriage and intermixing outside the group. And another interesting point that Ambedkar makes is, this is one thing many Hindus resist this idea. They even project it as a great benefit of Hinduism. Even I, to some extent, feel that it's one of the plus points of Hinduism, that it's not a missionary religion. We are not out to convert anybody. Ambedkar says, look, Hinduism must have been a missionary religion at one time because it spread all over India. India is a vast expanse of land with multiple diversities. And at some point in its history, Hinduism must have been a missionary religion, but that stopped. And that is because of the caste system, which put walls and barriers between people and prevented communication, which Ambedkar had talked about earlier. Okay. Yeah. And then referring to the Sikhs and the Muslims, Ambedkar says that they defeated Hindus repeatedly. And he says even that, the people talk about Sikh courage and Muslim courage as opposed to Hindu cowardice. And he says the problem with Hindu society is not cowardice. And the plus point of Sikh or Muslim society is not some inherent genetic bravery. There's no such thing. But they have a sense of solidarity, which is rooted in communication, which is rooted in shared practices of social living. And that is what Hindu society lacks. Okay. So he, he says, so the only way in which you can bring unity and reform is to break caste barriers. And, and if you look at the history of reform movements, I'm giving a few examples like the Vokkaligas of Karnataka. Okay. They were not one caste at one time, several castes. But they realized that unity was necessary in the common interest of garnering benefits under the colonial administration. And they decided to drop several differences which were preventing intermarriage and interdining and various things among them. And they consolidated themselves into one caste. The Nayars of Kerala were actually more than 120 castes. But again, a similar story happened here. They consolidated themselves into one caste. The Iravas were more than 100 castes. I'm not an expert on Kerala history, but this is from a dissertation, very painstakingly and extensively researched dissertation on Irava history, and they consolidated themselves. Whereas you look at the Lingayats of Karnataka or the Kabir Panthis, who talked about the removal of caste, but they did not walk the talk, and they did not pose any serious challenge to intermarriage and against endogamy. They ended up becoming just another caste in the caste constellation. And the same thing happened to Vokkaligas and Nayars and Iravas, when they stopped the intermarriage thing. Okay. So that is why caste is so divisive. And later on, in one particular, in some speech or writing, Ambedkar even says caste is inherently anti-national. It comes in the way of our thinking as a nation. And you fast forward to Homi Bhabha, who says that nation is an imagined community. And there is a tremendous resonance. Ambedkar is so prescient in the sense that he had thought about imagined community before he was Baba. Before Baba, I would say. Even in his book on Pakistan, he talks about imagined community as being the foundation stone of nationhood. And he says that we are unable to, Hindus and Indians are unable to constitute that kind of imagined community in a serious manner. So he says in Hindu society, there is no public spirit, there is no public charity, there is no public opinion. It's a constant negotiation. Sometimes a war, sometimes a negotiation, sometimes a bargaining, sometimes a coming together and splitting apart of various contingent alliances. But it is all these things of various caste interests and caste groups. Okay. There is no common public spirit or public charity or public opinion. Okay. And that is why, if you look at it, Ambedkar doesn't point it out, but I'm sure, being the man he was, I'm sure that he thought of it. But there is this much that you can put into one speech. I can afford to be more expansive with my luxury. So even very microscopic minority communities like Christians and Parsis, they are much more visible in the charitable sector. Of course, Parsis are confined to Bombay and Gujarat, but there they are highly visible, highly conspicuous in charitable activities. Parsi Free Library, Parsi Hospital, Parsi this, Parsi that. Okay, and Christians all over India. Okay, I'm not talking about places in like Kerala or Goa or the northeastern, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland, where they are a very significant number. But even other states, Christians are more visible in the charitable sector than Hindus. Okay, and so he says, instead of caste, we need liberty, equality, and fraternity. Okay, again, this is taken from the French Revolution, but Ambedkar understood it maybe even more deeply than the people who created these terms, I would say. And it resonates through all his writings. Okay, it's like his talisman. It's his touchstone. Liberty, equality, and fraternity. And I quote, in an ideal society, there should be many interests consciously communicated and shared. There should be varied and free points of contact with other modes of association. In other words, there must be social endosmosis. This is fraternity, which is another name for democracy. Okay. Then the punchline, this is a quote which I love, which I like to keep sharing. He says, democracy is not merely a form of government. It is primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. It is essentially an attitude of respect and reverence towards fellow men. Okay. Democracy is not merely a form of government. It is primarily a mode of associated living, of conjoint communicated experience. It is essentially an attitude of respect and reverence towards fellow men. Okay. So then, there are people who defend the caste system either unintentionally by default or deliberately, saying that equality is not a reality. You're talking about, is the United States equal, or Saudi Arabia equal, it's a big obsession with regressives in India. They always talk about Saudi and Pak and Iran and all that. Or they rewind 400 years and talk about the Mughals. Anyway, but we come to this. he says that it may not be a reality. It's not a reality, fine. But it should be a governing principle. It's like a starting line. If you have a race, there are definitely people who will run faster than the others. But that is not an excuse for having different starting lines. The starting line has to be the same. So he says that, it is very difficult to classify people in a just manner based on their ability or quote unquote merit, okay, which is another pet word of many sections. It is difficult to classify people based on merit because yardsticks of merit are very subjective. Your merit depends on who you are, what you have experienced, what you have been taught to value as good or great. And we have to seriously ask whether there is something universal, whether there is one size fits all merit existing anywhere. And he says it's difficult to classify people because there are many intervening factors. There are so many factors at play that you can't classify people based on, he doesn't use the word merit, but ability or merit, as I would like to use it. And he says, so the solution is that to begin with, he doesn't say forever and forever. He says, but to begin with, any society which wants to establish decent and dignified living and move into modernity has to treat everybody equal to begin with. Okay. Then Ambedkar says, the Arya Samajists, they claim that Chaturvarnyam is not based on birth, but on gunas or qualities. Okay. Bhagavad Gita also says the same thing. In fact, Ambedkar has even complimented the Bhagavad Gita. I mean, compliment in the sense he has not gone overboard and said it's wonderful, but he has granted the fact that the Bhagavad Gita does not, unlike the Vedas, unlike the Shastras, it does not assign birth-based caste, but it assigns so-called ability-based caste. Okay, Ambedkar recognizes that. Okay, and so he says qualities, but then why? The first question, again going back to the earlier thing, why give labels to qualities? He says labels make things rigid. Okay. Then the second thing he says, ability is something which is like 1,000 flowers. People talk about at least 8 types of intelligences in people. Ability manifests in so many ways among individuals, and you can't put all those ways into 4 boxes. And he says the very fact that there are thousands of caste groups, that is testimony, that is evidence for the failure of Chaturvarnya, because the 4 boxes are not working. And another thing which he points out is that why do you have such barbarous punishments for people who violate the rules of Varna? If it is based on ability and not on birth, then why do you have such barbarous punishments? Like Shudras who listen to the Vedas, they should have hot lead poured into their ears. Shudras who recite the Vedas should have their tongues pulled out. Okay, these rules are there in the Shastras, and people took them quite seriously, even in the 1920s. This is from my personal knowledge, because my ancestors lived in a Brahmin Agraharam in Palakkad, and the elders in the family have said this, and it has passed down to me that Shudras who used to walk through the Agraharam streets on rare occasions to render various services, if they heard Veda Parayanam, they used to actually close their ears because they had been intimidated by these Shastras. It was happening even in the 20s, hopefully not now, but it was happening. And he said, if it is not birth-based, then why this? It's illogical. And in the Ramayana, you have this famous incident of Rama killing a Shudra called Shambuka for doing tapas. Okay. Of course, there is a controversy whether Valmiki had mentioned this or whether it was interpolated, inserted there by later editions. And there is some evidence to show that It could have been a later insertion, but whatever it is, it has come down to us that Rama killed Shambhuka, and there are plenty of people who even justify it even today. I have myself heard some. So, why this? And then he says, this whole system talks about men. Where are the women? It's not as if women are absent in the labor force. You go to any part of India to the fields at harvest time, and you bloody well see that there are plenty of women. They have not disappeared anywhere. But where are women in this system, this so-called ability-based system? And he says that caste is present in other religions also. It's a curse. Ambedkar described it as a monster that crosses your path wherever you go in India. Yes, it is a curse. It's present in other communities also. But he says that there are some threads in other communities which bind people more strongly than caste. Caste and untouchability are there in Muslims, but the 5 pillars are common to all Muslims. Castes and untouchability are there among the Sikhs. The Dalit Sikhs are known as Mazhabi Sikhs, and other Sikhs like Jat Sikhs and others, they don't marry Mazhabis. At least they were not doing so till the 1990s on reliable knowledge. After that, I don't know. But no Sikh is barred entry into a Gurdwara. And to the best of Ambedkar's knowledge, though not Tamil knowledge or Malayali knowledge, Christians were not barred from churches. Of course, we know that, in South India, we have seen very rampant casteism even among Christians, alive and kicking. And we know that Dalit Christians had to either start a separate church like Black Christians in the United States, or they were seated in a separate part of the church and all that. But, among Muslims and Sikhs, at least, there are certain binding factors which are stronger than caste. Okay. Then people say that, okay, in spite of caste is very bad, blah, 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 but in spite of caste, Hinduism has survived. So if it were so bad, why hasn't it already destroyed Hinduism? 2000 years and the destruction hasn't happened. So, and Ambedkar says, okay, Hinduism has survived. Granted. But what kind of survival has it been? What kind of moral and spiritual and social plane have you been surviving on? You have to ask that question. Even animals survive. Donkeys and pigs survive. Okay. So that's my addition, not Ambedkar. Ambedkar was a very courteous and polite man. Not like me. Anyway, so abolition of subcaste or survival, all these things, they are not the answer. If you abolish subcaste, like we have seen with many Brahmins, Nayars, Ejavas, Vokaligas, it only leads to bigger and more vicious caste groupings. It doesn't. It doesn't take away the problem. It might bring some immediate benefits. Ejava consolidation, Nayar consolidation increased the bargaining power of these few hundred communities with the British administration or with the client administration being run by princely states. But we did not move beyond that point. Okay. So he says this, again, he says it in many places, not just in this book, that intermarriage is the only solution. And he says that caste is ultimately a state of mind. And so we must attack the religion which teaches people notions of caste. And this is where he makes a very powerful, controversial, and potentially, you might say, offensive or extremist statement. But we have to face it, we have to reckon with it. He says you must put the dynamite to the Vedas and the Shastras. Okay. By putting the dynamite to Vedas and Shastras, he says that you must reject their authority as sacred texts. There is no harm in studying them. I'm a big fan of Vedic recitation. For the music, I think it's very musical and it's very vibrant. It gives a certain physical inner vibrancy. But that is where I draw the line, and Ambedkar says that you don't take them as sacred texts. Ambedkar himself studied them. He himself studied them. And he says, reject their authority as sacred texts. And he says, you cannot say that they have been misinterpreted or misunderstood. The Arya Samajist argument was that the Vedas are perfect, but they have been misinterpreted and misunderstood by the Pauranikas, the people who came after the waning of Vedic influence in India, according to the Arya Samajists. And he says, you can't say that it's all misunderstanding, misinterpretation. He says, because when misunderstandings and misinterpretations survive for centuries, you have got to deal with them. You can't keep saying misunderstanding, misunderstanding, misunderstanding. How many centuries are you going to say that? Okay. So he says, and Ambedkar is not very optimistic in this particular book. Ambedkar, in his writing and speeches, in many ways, he was a pessimist. But towards the end of his life, I have myself been amazed to the extent to which he was an optimist. I won't share the stories now, but there are several instances. But in this book, he is a little pessimistic, and he says that the caste system won't go because the intellectual class among Hindus, the Brahmins, the people at the apex of the system, the people on top of the system, the top of the pecking order, or the stamping order, they are the intellectual class. And it's the intellectual class that maintains and perpetuates hegemony. And he says class is a descending scale of rights, and everybody, the whole system has been designed in such a way that almost everybody has got certain rights, over somebody else. The right to oppress somebody else. Okay. It's not a very democratic or ethical right. But the right to oppress is something which does exist, unconsciously, but very strongly in all our minds. We should introspect and face it. And everybody in the system has got some right to oppress. They are not giving it up. That has led to the continued survival of the system. Okay. Interpreting the Vedas and Smritis is condemned. Okay. And even if you interpret, it's like first you obey the Shastras and the rules in place, and then you interpret, which makes nonsense out of the whole interpretive exercise. And he says, and that is the problem, they are barred from rational thinking on this particular issue. And he says, that is why, there are Hindus who break caste barriers. Gandhi himself went abroad. He did a Shuddhi Sanskar after coming back and all that. And he says that is the whole problem, because even if you break caste rules, there is a Shuddhi Sanskar which gives you a way out, which gives you a kind of entry, an entry pass back into caste purity, back into the framework, into the box of caste purity. So you don't need to seriously ask whether the rules are rational in the first place. You are spared that necessity. And that is a big curse. Okay. So he says that is why, we need to, that is why, because we have these prayashchitas for breaking caste rules. People haven't confronted the problem of caste, and they haven't started asking why the rules should exist in the first place. Okay, Ambedkar, again, let me remind you, he was writing this in 1935. Things might have changed quite a lot. They haven't changed quite a lot, but they have changed quite a lot also, perhaps. Okay, Ambedkar himself was pretty optimistic about the future generations of Hindus. He has talked about it somewhere. Anyway, coming back to this. And so, the Sadachar, the Smritis and the Shrutis, and the Sadachar codes, they tell you, that if you violate caste rules, you cannot be saved, even if you do good things. Even if you follow the example of the gods, it doesn't save you from punishment. and various levels of excommunication and ostracism for violating caste rules. Okay. Then he says that religion should be governed by principles, not by rules, because living by rules is mechanical. You know, you are given a set of things and you follow like Kanka. Whereas principles are statements of what is right and wrong. They are a broad framework. And you can take from principles and design rules according to time and place and necessity. You have a certain flexibility. And he says that unfortunately, Hinduism in practice, he allows a little bit for the theory, like he allows that to some extent Vedas and even a little bit, Bhagavad Gita and certainly the Upanishads, at the level of philosophical speculation, fine. There is some flexibility, but the rules are very rigid. And Hinduism in practice, in living practice, is rule governed. And that makes it rigid. And people don't modify rules. Manusmriti is not accepted so much as a scripture. Manu is not worshipped anywhere in India, in terms of ritual formal worship, except in Manali in Himachal Pradesh. There is a Manu temple there. But otherwise, he's not like Shiva or Vishnu or Vinayaka or anybody else. But people follow the rules of caste more than anything else, particularly when it comes to life partner selection. And in North India and in the other more caste-ridden states, even in our neighboring Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh, Telangana, people follow caste in their social living to a great extent. And definitely in partner selection, it's there almost everywhere. And that is the problem. That keeps it intact. That keeps it firmly in place. Okay. So these are all the things, and he says that, whether we borrow from the French Revolution, from foreign sources, liberty, equality, fraternity, or we borrow from the Upanishads, he says that we need to destroy the old body. He says, I quote, "New life can enter only a new body. The old body must die before a new body can come into existence and a new life can enter into it." And he says caste is a threat to the survival of the nation. Okay. And he says that caste must not be transmitted to future generations. Good ideas should be transmitted, not bad ideas. And he says that nothing is eternal, standards must be revised from time to time. And okay, then we come to his arguments with Gandhi. He says that Gandhi talks about Varnashrama Dharma. We have dealt with this argument already, so I won't get into it in detail. But he says that look at Gandhi, even, he was a Banya, a Vaishya. He did not follow the Banya profession. He became a politician, which is a kind of Kshatriya. And he became a public intellectual, which is a kind of Brahmin. He was not a Vaishya. So there, Gandhi himself flounders at the rock of Varnashrama Dharma. The Varnashrama Dharma is okay theory. Gandhi says Ambedkar is a little harsh on Hinduism, and Ambedkar is judging Hinduism by Manusmriti. Hinduism has got Upanishads, Hinduism has got the Bhakti movement. There have been great saints, great reformers. Ambedkar says, okay, there have been great saints, there is great philosophy, there have been great reformers, but these people have not had any lasting impact. And however great a reformer you are, however great you may be personally, however many taboos you might have personally broken, if you have not violated the wrong social rules, if you have not launched an attack on a very fundamentally wrong social system, then somewhere you have accepted the evil of caste. So however great a person, however big a saint you may be, you are not really a saint, because the caste system is immoral. And if you don't unequivocally reject it in theory and practice, it's a painful thing, but you become immoral. So that's the end of my talk. I'm sorry I took too much time. Jai Bhim. I'm open for questions.
Yes, sir. I can see that in kind of enthusiasm with Ambedkar, you are describing Ambedkar in such kind of energy, and we have to stop here. And some from the students' point of view, you can give some important questions that will be coming for the exams.
Questions may relate. I don't know if I had a look at the previous papers, even last year's paper on annihilation of caste. There were plenty of questions. Uh, but I can imagine, I haven't looked at those papers, but I can imagine that people might talk about his refutation of Gandhi, which is important. Uh, his counter arguments to the arguments defending caste, which is important. His arguments advancing why social reform must come before economic and political reform. You know, these are very quintessential Ambedkar ideas and arguments. And so I can imagine that questions would enter around them quite likely. And yeah, these are the three main areas, the broad areas where you can expect questions. And then, about what he means by liberty, equality, and fraternity. Fraternity, particularly in Annihilation of Caste, his main concern is with the fraternity part of it, where, what is really necessary in a society to create fellow feeling, to create the feeling that we are all really one and we have certain common interests and common purposes. Okay. We may not have a common past. We may or may not have a common past. Unfortunately, we tend to be past fixated and we look for a past, we invent a past if we don't find one. But a common future, and what should be the basis of a common future? And Ambedkar's unequivocal answer to this is fraternity, which can happen only through constant communication, exchange of ideas, and shared beliefs, shared practices, conjoint social living. And then, the question of endogamy is also important. Ambedkar talks more about it when he delivered a lecture in Columbia University, which was later published, which came before this speech, on the origin of castes. There he talks about marriage, intermarriage, those issues, and this is another quintessential Ambedkar argument, where he says that intermarriage is the ultimate key to throwing out the caste system. Nothing else will give a lasting solution. So these, I imagine, would be the broad areas. I will try to access the previous question from an ex-student of mine, and people may feel free after 2 days. Please feel free to text me, and I will share those things. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, and you talked about some books like from the Ministry of External Affairs, we get that PDF files and some books of by Ilahi and all you mentioned. From exam point of view, can you mention some books?
If you have a lot of time, you should read Ambedkar's little book, not a very long book, on the origin of castes. You needn't read it in very great detail. You can run through it and take the essential points. And the same thing you could do with his book, again, not a very long book, on the philosophy of Hinduism. Again, you can run through it, you can do a little bit of selective reading and talk more about the portions regarding the Manusmriti and how the Manusmriti is operative. If you have plenty of time, these are certain things which can be done. The Ministry of External Affairs website is a source for all his writings and speeches. It was a big project undertaken under the UPA 1 government. and they collected all his available writings and speeches and compiled them into these volumes. There are printed volumes also, subsidized and published by Government of Maharashtra. And there are PDF volumes, 17 volumes. Some are in more than one part. So there are around 21 PDF files. You just hit MEA Ambedkar free download and you will get it. And velivada.com is a site. There are many sites. velivada.com is a site where you get resources. And there are plenty of YouTube channels like Dalit Camera and others, which deal with Ambedkarite issues. So if you are the visual kind of person and you have the time, these are things that you could go through to strengthen your understanding of Ambedkar and annihilation of caste. And I have prepared a short summary of annihilation of caste, which again, if you contact me even tonight after 9 p.m., I would be happy to share. I don't need your identity. You just send a message asking for it and I will send you the PDF. Yeah, I have an email ID. Okay, it's GISIK MATGRIK. GISIK MATGRIK. It's one word. Okay, at gmail.com.
Okay, so we'll be stopping here, and thank you very much for. It was a great pleasure hearing you about Ambedkar, and imbibing him is not like it has a limit, right? So we will be stopping here, and for all the attendees, we'll be uploading this session in ASAP Kerala YouTube channel, and yeah, thank you all the attendees, and thank you very much, sir, for this great
Thank you.
session.